Edward's Rocky Recovery. Written and told by Kiefer Adams. "I am surprised at you, Edward," said the Fat Controller one evening. "You should have known better than to have your pipes tied down before you left the docks. You caused, and I can't believe I'm saying this to you, confusion and delay." "I'm truly sorry, sir," said Edward. "I'm also disappointed that you and Gordon would stoop to such a level about Rocky," the Fat Controller continued. "At least he proved today that I made the right choice in buying another crane for the island. I know things were tough when Preston used to be on the island, but that's no excuse to insult other cranes." "Again, I'm truly sorry, sir," said Edward, "and I promise it will never happen again." "I'm sure it won't," said the Fat Controller. "I expect better from you, Edward." The Fat Controller turned and walked away. Thomas was in the berth next to Edward and had heard everything. "What have I done?" said Edward. "I can't believe I did that." "It's all right, though," said Thomas. "I'm sure Rocky will understand. Just because Preston treated you bad doesn't mean you have to be upset with Rocky." Edward sighed and said no more. The next day, Harvey was on patrol at the line near Black Lock. He was surprised to find a rock slide had fallen there, and he hurried to fetch Rocky. Rocky was just as powerful as he had been on his first day. With his grabber, Harvey was able to clear most of the rubble, but the bigger rocks were tackled by Rocky himself. "You and I certainly make a great pair," said Harvey when Rocky had finished. "Well, I'm just glad to help," Rocky smiled. "Is, Edward all right?" "I think so," replied Harvey. "I saw him this morning, but he looked rather upset about yesterday." "I'm sure he'll be all right," said Rocky. "Between you and me, Harvey, he's not the first engine to have misjudged my strength and performance. I got it a lot from the engines on the other railway where I used to work." "I can imagine," said Harvey. "However," said Rocky, "I can look past it. Besides, I would really like to have an engine take me to all the emergencies on the island." "I'm sure you'll find the right one in time," said Harvey. "But you just need to settle first. All new arrivals must do, of course." Rocky completely understood. The Fat Controller had been on the other railway during this day. He had travelled as far as a small scrapyard on the mainland. Martha, the open cab tank engine, was rather concerned. "Is he even right for the job?" she wondered. Murray, the large crane, who had used to enjoy teasing devious Diesel when the shunter used to live on the other railway, noticed Martha.
"Well, I don't know,"
he rumbled.
"I think he was quite interested in coming to the Sodor Controller's line. It might prove beneficial."
"I suppose," said Martha. "But why would Diesel need to be taught another lesson?" Murray gave a small chuckle.
"My dear Martha, I don't think it's Diesel that he's going to be seeing."
Martha sighed. She thought nothing of it and went back to work, while Murray dozed in the afternoon sun. Early the next morning, Edward was surprised when his driver and fireman came early. "Wake up, old boy," they said. "The Fat Controller wants to see you at the docks." Edward was frantic. Once everything was ready, he made his way to Brendam. Gordon was already there. He was waiting for passengers on board the SS Rockstar. But he was not the only engine at the docks when Edward arrived. "And what time do you call this?" asked Josiah, as Edward came to a sudden halt. "Well, bust my buffers," exclaimed Edward. "My old friend! What on earth are you doing here?" "Your controller came to visit me yesterday," said Josiah. "Diesel might have put in a good word. I'm glad to see that he's still learning sense. Edward smiled. But I'm not here to see Diesel, said Josiah. I think we need a talk, Edward groaned. It just so happened that the Fat Controller actually did want to see Edward. He wanted to show Josiah the way to the steelworks. The two engines had a delivery to make there, and they set off once their trucks were loaded. All was going well as Edward and Josiah puffed along to the steelworks. But when they reached the countryside, Edward suddenly stopped. Josiah noticed. Is anything wrong? He asked. Oh, Josiah, groaned Edward. I've done something terrible, and it's something that even affected me from a long time ago. Is this the crane situation? Asked Josiah knowingly. That big strong blue engine sort of cleared things up before you arrived. Of course Gordon would, sighed Edward. Edward took a deep breath and explained everything. He talked about Preston. He talked about how the engines had been when Harvey first arrived, with him of course being one of them, and he also mentioned Rocky. Josiah listened contently. It seems you've had a problem with cranes ever since this Preston caused you grief, he said at last. Edward, you're not as young as you used to be. Quite frankly, neither am I, but you need to let this section of your past go. This Rocky could be beneficial for the island, but he can't move on his own. He'll need someone to help him. I get that, puffed Edward, but what can I do? I know what you can do, said Josiah. Let's continue on our journey. I'll explain. Edward set off again, following closely behind his old friend. The next morning, Edward woke up especially early. Josiah had since returned to the other railway. He had claimed that the scrapyard he worked at wasn't going to sort itself out. During the morning, Rocky had been shunted at the works near Tidmouth Sheds. Edward saw this as an opportunity. Rocky, he whispered. Rocky? What? Oh, Edward, what time is it? Almost dawn, Edward whispered. But I need to tell you something. Rocky listened. I'm so sorry for my behaviour, puffed Edward. I've had a bad experience with one crane in the past, and it clouded my judgment on others that came after him. Could you forgive an old engine like me? And to make it up to you, can I take you to the emergencies that you're required for? That would be an honour, Edward, and thank you. It means a lot to me. Edward felt pleased. The Fat Controller agreed immediately that Edward should be Rocky's assistant engine to wherever he was needed. And never again did Edward think that cranes were troublesome on the island of Sodor. And all he had to thank was his old friend, Josiah.